In our previous chapters, we've explored how Olympia's scandal was directly linked to a philosophical taboo that she, Olympia, denounced. Edouard Manet's masterpiece exposed the hypocrisy that surrounded the period's academic discourse, that decadence and lust were the true identifiers of academicism. In the third chapter, we will uncover a second, social and sexual taboo.
The painting is accompanied by a poem by Zachary Astruc. When tired of dreaming, Olympia awakens. Spring enters on the arms of the mild black messenger. She is the slave who, like the amorous night, comes to adorn with flowers the day beautiful to behold. The august young woman is whom ardour is ever wakeful. Here is a critic's comment. What verse! What a picture! Olympia awakes, weary from dreaming. She has had a bad night, that is evident. Insomnia and colic have disturbed her serenity. Her colour indicates as much. There are two black messengers, a cat which has been unfortunately flattened between two railway sleepers, a negress who has nothing about her that recalls the amorous night, unless it be a bouquet bought at the florist's on the corner and paid for by Monsieur Arthur, which tells me a great deal about Olympia. Arthur is certainly in the antechamber, waiting. She waits for clients. There were many sobriquets circulating at the time. Arthur for the lovers and Lorette for the girls. Well, Lorette was more of a category. As sobriquet, you had Olympia, Flore, Anastasie, Lucrèce, Delphine, Sidonie, and the inevitable Virginie. It so happens that the act of prostitution, that is, the vice, had been placed under control since the Napoleonic Code. According to réglementarism, in 1802, prostitutes had the sanitary obligation of having medical checkups, and from 1804 were contained and supervised in what we call maisons closes, or brothels. When it came to prostitution, the principal preoccupation wasn't really of moral order, but of sanitary concerns. In this way, a certain Alexandre Parent du Châtelet, hygienist and doctor who was formerly a specialist on sewers, published of prostitution in the city of Paris, a real goldmine for historians. So this man, a specialist in sewers of filth, became, in a logical continuity, a specialist of so-called sewers of semen. He meant prostitution. Here they are, the prostitutes, painted by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec during the brothel's mandatory medical checkup. This visit was considered a far more hideous act than catering for a client. I'll take this opportunity for a reminder about numbers. Many artists were taken ill by venereal disease. Paul Gauguin and Edouard Manet both died of it. The numbers are surprising. It is thought that there were around 1 million people who contracted syphilis in Paris around 1900. If you get the chance, do read Stefan Zweig's World of Yesterday, where it is revealed that even the young had this disease. He writes that every 2 in 10 youths enrolled in the army had syphilis. You might have imagined these numbers only to be high among those who'd been sexually active for 20 years or so. Zweig also reminds us that in Vienna, 1 in 7 houses had a plaque for doctors who specialized in skin diseases, which meant syphilitic acne, hence the necessity for controlling places of contamination via medical checkups. These prostitutes were monitored by customs police and were called registered prostitutes. They worked in enclosed brothels and had 2 legal possibilities for practicing. Either they were en carte or en numéro. En carte meant that they each had an ID card and could independently practice without being reliant on a brothel, but they weren't allowed to solicit new clients in the street. The card listed their information, noting in particular their sanitary obligations at Saint-Lazare. Or women were en numéro, which refers to their assigned number in the brothel keeper's ledger. When they didn't respond to one of the conditions, they became clandestine and thus condemnable. Here is a representation of the girls who embarked upon the dépôt before being questioned, and they look profoundly tired of this. We can recognise the Marie-Joseph sisters, who were known for being more severe with prostitutes than with other convicts. The unregistered ones were penned up, considered to be rebellious because they had neither a card nor a number. These streetwalkers were forced to get medical checks at Saint-Lazare and were potentially held back a few weeks in the hospital prison for prostitutes. Curiously, the number of brothels dropped drastically during the second half of the 19th century. Here is La Rue de Moulins, a house where Toulouse-Lautrec had more or less been elected resident. He paints the dominating red interior, as well as the flamboyant red hair of the female figures, a style that was particularly appreciated at the time. The numbers of licensed brothels in Paris were indeed decreasing. In 1843, 235 were counted. But by the mid-1870s, already half of those had disappeared. Everything seemed to go in favour of the abolitionists. But at the same time, the number of women working in brothels was about 1,900. And 10 years later, this figure had fallen to 1,200. Once again, considering this low statistic, why speak about Paris like it was the new Babylon? Were the patrols doing their job properly? Here is the profile of one of its most prominent members, nicknamed Father Decency, Père le Pudeur.
dont vous reconnaissez le profil dans ce tableau de Lautrec au Moulin Rouge.
You see it again in another Moulin Rouge poster. Here he is on the left.
À gauche. Que faisait la police?
What was the Vice Brigade doing? It was supposedly there to control prostitution and get rid of clandestine workers through tyrannical raids.
Ce qu'on appelait les soumis, sous le contrôle d'une maison close ou encartée.
One of the arguments against the Vice Brigade, however, was that it was itself infiltrated with people who had a triple position as clients, procurers and police agents.
Et probablement proxénètes.
This meant that during the years of moral order, there was a dissolution of the Vice Brigade, as it was itself corrupted and therefore counterproductive. But the Vice Brigade did have a real reason for existence, which was to assure control over clandestine prostitution. Since official prostitution was becoming extinct, the number of rebels was exploding.
Est en forte croissance, c'est une explosion. Entre les années 70 et
Between the 70s and 80s, the police announced that there were 30,000 rebel prostitutes, although a certain Maxime Dupont speaks of some 120,000. You would be right in pointing out that there is a problem with the numbers. The difference between 30,000 and 120,000 is really very wide. However, this discrepancy is actually because no one knew where prostitution started and ended. Between 1870 and 1900, it is thought that there were 155,000 registered and a whopping 75,000 unregistered prostitutes, numbers that would suggest that 1 in 4 Parisians slept with prostitutes. Seeing these numbers, I thought it could not be possible, 40,000 in a day. Yet if you consider these numbers in light of the Parisian population and conjugal customs, it does actually make sense. So, now let's have a look at the geography of prostitution in Paris. The richness in vocabulary denoting different types of prostitutes is extraordinary. Some were called Lorettes, so in Notre Dame we have the Des Lorettes neighbourhood. Then there were the so-called Fénétrières, because they solicited custom from their windows. The soupeurs were those who recruited American tourists in brasseries and who offered something a little warmer for dinner.
Vous aviez la casinette.
The casinettes sought their clients at casinos' balls.
Bal qui drainait le client au bal du casino. Vous avez la boulevardière qui traînait.
The boulevardières recruited on boulevards, and the étudiants could be found further south, near the Sorbonne, who specialised in student clientele. There were also the verseuses, or waitresses, although this term only appeared in 1867. 1867 was the year of the Universal Exhibition in Paris, and when many of these so-called brasseries opened, brasserie à femmes, for sex workers. Why? Because they realised that it was more desirable to have a charming waitress instead of a waiter. And when presented with the occasion, these verseuses would make use of their charms and engage in salacious activities in furnished rooms, or on some seedy mattress put up in the establishment's courtyard.
Peu ragoûtant.
At the bottom of the social scale of prostitution were those who specialised in military men. They haunted the rampart, from which derives their nickname rampardieuses. And then in the Boulogne woods, there were the ladies of the lake, who stationed themselves by the banks of the water, and those of the north, the boulogneuses.
Quand on dit en français, c'est une
Boulogneuse means both the one soliciting in Bois de Boulogne, but also is an adjective for hard worker.
toutes ces femmes.
Many girls and young women, single or married, rich or poor, of all social scales, were likely to, every now and then, make a bit of venal money from sex. In this painting, signed by Pascal Dagnon-Bergère, two men who appear to be students are looking back at a laundress. I also decided to show you a preparatory drawing from 1879 in ink and graphite on paper, because we can see that at first this was not a student, but a bourgeois man in a top hat looking back at the implicated woman. Should we believe that his move was motivated by compassion? Is it true that the young woman seems a bit sad and exhausted? But wouldn't this be the right time to pounce? He'd say to himself, I might get lucky. If we look at The Shop Girl by James Tissot, we can see a shop assistant opening the door who is ready to hand over some purchases. Here we are most likely faced with a client who was originally bourgeois.
On parle d'une clientèle.
Firstly, we know this because the luxurious ribbons point towards a bourgeois purse, but also because her coachman is waiting for her, and both horses are pulling a fiacre, unless it's actually a cabriolet, which would have been even more fashionable. What interests me in this painting is what's happening here. This man with a pince-nez seems to be examining the products. Is his intention really to buy ribbons and a corset for his wife? I doubt it. Instead, there is a symbolic indicator of licentious desire. Look at how this bust hugs the man's torso, intimately imitating an embrace. The drawing allows for a shift. This bust mirrors exactly that of the woman holding the door open, and maybe also this one that we see from a three-quarter profile. She is looking at him, but we will never know whether she is saying yes or no. Is she inviting him into the back of the shop? All possibilities are open. We also have this Augustin Renoir painting, The Umbrellas, which he started in 1881 but only finished in 1885 or 6. At first, the painting depicted the scene of a family outing. A well-dressed mother here, conversing with the little girl with a benevolent smile. And it is perhaps her older sister who appears next to her. However, in 1885 he added this couple, a woman holding a basket, associated with modest social conditions, who is holding her dress, which makes sense since it was raining and she is trying to avoid getting wet. However, if we look closer, we can observe the proximity and the interest of the man behind, a student, a young bourgeois. Is he not looking for the shopkeeper or dressmaker? Once again, ambiguity adds to the painting's charm, and for a while it destabilizes the viewer. Now let's analyse this painting by Tissot, The Maid of Honour, or The Voyager. We have a well-dressed woman, a bridesmaid, who these shopkeepers are admiring, and this boy is booing. There is a feeling of intimacy shown here between both figures, and only a three-dimensional reconstitution allows us to both recreate a convenient space between these faces. But the intimacy is in fact rather strong, and this man seems keen to take his gloves off in a hurry to disengage. But why, we might ask? This is all too ambiguous. Now we are going to look at a series by Jean Bourgeois, The Wait, a prostitution scene on a boulevard. Here we have boulevardières or grisettes who are waiting for a meet-up. Very often, like the proposition, they let themselves be conquered in order to forget the venal and financial transaction.
Au profit d'une certaine réussite d'une conquête du client qui payera toutefois. Voici donc la proposition.
On the right, on the boulevard, a bourgeois man has stopped in the middle of the road. He doesn't seem particularly suicidal, so why does he halt? Is he stopping so the prostitute has enough time to hastily join him? I remind you that soliciting men was banned, and therefore discretion was key in situations such as this. Nevertheless, Bergère painted this one as she raises her petticoat. How terrible, how scandalous for a woman to offer a glimpse of her heels or ankles. As for her negligee, this should never, never be seen. I was saying earlier on that maybe in front of a puddle, one could dare to lift the hem and reveal the petticoat. But here there is neither umbrella nor puddle. So why is she showing off her petticoat? By the way, the bourgeoisie woman here has taken out her binoculars to ogle at the spectacle and does not seem best pleased. She's watching her, outraged. And then here, one man acknowledges another with a military salute. Are they potential clients? Still audacious without a raindrop, Giovanni Boldini painted the florist or dressmaker with her petticoat out, a detail that was not left unnoticed by the bourgeois sat behind in a fiacre. Is he eyeing her up? Here again we have a milliner, an errand girl, and her visible petticoat. And still no excuse, no umbrella, no rain. The bourgeois is watching her from under a delicate veil. With her shiny red lips she is carefully made up. The painter took care to use a very bright shade of red for the daytime. What a scandal! Listen to a commentator from back then. Is it possible that the art of making oneself up has infiltrated from the Rue Brenda? By this, he means that it has moved from the prostitutes' neighbourhood into honourable bourgeois interiors. People were shocked, and I can't help but remind you that in 1770, admittedly it was a century beforehand, but women who wore makeup, who wore little heels and showed off their petticoats, could be accused and condemned for witchcraft in England. Years had gone by since, and the bourgeoisie were allowed to wear makeup, but only a little, and certainly not like this on the Champs-Élysées in the middle of the day, and by way of a slight sense of modesty, only wearing a veil. Although this is a black and white reproduction, the figure was also wearing red. But red, just like that on the lips, is the sign of the prostitute that we also find here with Jean-Louis Forain, a clandestine prostitute soliciting clients.
Qui racole ou qui cherche client.
There is this famous Alexandre Dumas phrase from 1867. We are on the path to universal prostitution. My God, what horrors this route would contain. A certain Charles Lecourt wrote in The Prostitution of London and Paris, uncontrolled prostitutes, that is to say non-registered, form the majority of the personnel of prostitution in Paris. They are everywhere, in the café concerts, the theatres, the balls. One meets them in the public establishments, railway stations, and even railway carriages. They are on all the promenades, in front of most of the cafes. Late into the night, they circulate in great numbers on all of the finest boulevards, to the great scandal of the public, which takes them for registered prostitutes breaking the rules, and thus is astonished at the inaction of the police in their regard. Courtesans were everywhere. We have another category, that of the grande cocotte, the demi-mondaine, a term that is derived from a play in 5 acts by Dumas. We also call her grande horizontale, a lioness, and you can see that there was a whole vocabulary to define modern Paris courtesans. This one is Nana, painted by Manet and then borrowed by Émile Zola in his eponymous novel Nana. We do not actually know whether Nana's name came from the novel written a few years later, or rather if Zola borrowed his title from Manet. Regardless, you have a young lady here whose traits were modelled on those of a certain Henriette Osé, courtesan and official mistress to the Prince William of Orange.
Attribuée du prince Guillaume d'Orange.
What interests me here is his bourgeois gaze. He is looking at her, but let me remind you of the conjugal rules. They were what we call conventual, which is emulating those from a convent, so you can probably imagine what they were like. The woman, the spouse in a bourgeois couple, didn't have access to her own body. She was not familiar with her physical appearance. The full-length mirror did not yet exist in the home and was only found in brothels, where mirrors were everywhere.
Chez les prostituées, dans les bordels, elle ne connaît pas son corps, elle se lave.
The woman washed herself bit by bit, but never touched herself, and had no idea about her own anatomy.
Sa propre anatomie. Les
bidets were obviously exclusive to prostitutes. The man, the husband, never saw his wife putting makeup on, and was even less likely to see her in her negligee. But here he revels in it. A little reminder, if you've ever taken a look into an antique wardrobe and found old nightshirts and dresses, you'll know that even during sexual intercourse, fondling was impossible. Sometimes the nightdress only had a small opening to permit sexual intercourse, purely for the purposes of procreation, and this opening was covered in embroidery if possible. So, in the home, we are very far from the visual foreplay that the painting is displaying. You can imagine that when the husband returned home, where embroideries encouraged prudishness, that his sexual behaviour was radically different to when he indulged with a prostitute. Among many others, Tissot became a specialist in painting socialites, or grandes cocottes. Here she is, young and beautiful, wealthily rigged out, accompanied by a man with white sideburns. It is the era of great courtesans. I'm thinking of Esther Lochman, in particular, known as La Paiva, who was as much a great prostitute as she was a diplomat and businesswoman.
Autant qu'une grande prostituée qui sait profiter financièrement de son corps, c'est une femme qui se marie.
She briefly married a nobleman from whom she kept her title and acquired an incredible estate, including a luxurious hôtel particulier on the Champs-Élysées. Then there were the second-rate little cocottes, dancers or actresses, and you had the tall horizontals, which included Sarah Bernhardt. It is said that in order to finance her hôtel particulier in the 17th arrondissement, she resorted to a few clandestine passes. Here she is again, this demi-mondaine by Tissot depicted in The Ball. We can still notice the age gap, since a luxurious cocotte was a superb attribute. The painting that interests me the most is The Ambitious, for it showcases an array of gazes in a society that was becoming ever more visual. Chatting on the right, this one has specs on and looks stunned. Then there's this woman's pose, which could not have been a spouse's. People would go to the balls with their conquests, with escorts in the front row, because they were a sign of prestige, of wealth and virility. They were thus everywhere, and as Maxime Ducamp wrote, these new courtesans' mission was to cretinize, to dull or dumb down the high bourgeoisie. Gustave Flaubert added, everything was false. A false army, a false politics, a false literature, false credit, and even false courtesans. With Olympia, we well and truly have the fake courtesan. I mentioned earlier a philosophical, aesthetic divide. Olympia was simultaneously a demi-mondaine and a filthy prostitute. She thus embodied the social and sexual cleavage of the torn bourgeois. To paraphrase Michael Foucault, torn between a conjugal sexuality limited to procreation and an extra-conjugal saucy sexuality. This time, I shall call it a cultural and sexual divide.
Voici donc le troisième point.
For our third section on Olympia, we are going to use a psychoanalytical instrument in order to expose, not her already unveiled charms, but her power.
Déjà été dévoilées, mais sa puissance. C'est son regard.
For this, we must become interested in her gaze. Olympia is staring at you, probably assuming that you are a male viewer. Yet traditionally, the nude does not stare.
Regardez ses yeux, elle vous regarde droit dans les yeux. Or, je vous disais, traditionnellement, le nu ne fixe pas.
This one, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ancret's Venus Anaïdémone, looks to the left. This one here is looking so intently the other way that she appears to be squinting.
A priori, elle est prise d'un certain strabisme. Elle n'a pas conscience d'être vue.
These nudes were never conscious of being seen, especially in the Valpersan bather. She is the object of our desire, but is not conscious of being seen.
Mais n'a pas conscience d'être vue. Moi, spectateur.
I, as a spectator, and probably originally a male spectator, am a subject, and she is the object of my gaze. I repeat, my gaze objectifies her. But here, the opposite occurs. We have a woman portrayed as she lounges on the sofa, her head held high as she confidently gazes directly at you. In this way, she is the subject and I, the male spectator, am the object of her gaze. I am being objectified and, therefore, petrified. I have lost my power as the subject. In mythical history and psychoanalytical history in particular, there is a text by Sigmund Freud from the 1920s that was posthumously published in the 1940s, called The Head of Medusa. The gaze that petrifies has a name, Medusa's gaze. Medusa was one of 3 sisters, and remember, whoever met her stare was petrified.
Son regard était pétrifié. On le retrouve dans la production hollywoodienne aujourd'hui.
Perseus was intelligent enough to use a mirror's reflection to slice off her head and defeat the monster.
Cette tête fut coupée, décollée.
The head finds itself in pictorial literature, in drawings, and here you have Medusa's head by a certain Calandrucci.
Depuis la Renaissance en particulier, voici la tête de Méduse d'un certain Calandrucci et plus connue, celle de Caravaggio.
More famous even is the one by Caravaggio. The slaughtered head retains its petrifying powers. It is on Perseus's shield, who can always use its formidable force. How does all of this context influence our understanding of Manet's Olympia? Well, Olympia inherited this power to petrify, to render the male spectator an object. Since she is conscious of her power, she is powerful. She is the subject, and she has subverted the traditional relationship between man and woman. However, there might be even more to this, especially if we look more closely at her hand. I was saying earlier that contrary to Titian's Venus of Urbino, Olympia's hand is firmly positioned on her genitals. But excuse me, no, it cannot be her genitals. I now recall this Lemonnier quote that the nude hides nothing because there is nothing to hide. Therefore, if Olympia is hiding something, it must mean that there is something to hide. I remind you that female genitalia was considered to be an absence of genitalia. So if the figure is protectively covering something, it might therefore be a phallus. This woman has recovered power. I remind you that the phallus is not just male genitalia itself, but it is power. In Freudian and psychoanalytical terms, it is authority. So with this in mind, we might consider that Olympia has recovered power within the confines of her own body. She is an authoritative woman. Instead of coming from within, the light illuminates her in a frontal manner, starkly exposing her power to the audience. If she hides her sex while she is on show, she may say, "You will see only if you pay." She has recovered the control over her body. But there is more to this interpretation. As I was saying, she is hiding her genitalia despite there not usually being anything for a woman to hide. She could be covering her modesty because there is a phallus beneath. Or, remember that in all ancient myths, you have what is called a vagina dentada, a toothed vagina that would castrate men who dare to enter. Perhaps this is the formidable weapon that Olympia hides under her hand. Everything is becoming clearer. The woman is phallic, the woman is a powerful castrator, a rival to man, who has fully recovered her body's power. Olympia also happened to be the name of the so-called female Pope Olympia, who was the sister-in-law and maybe mistress of Pope Innocent X. He was so dependent on her to make decisions that she was the one they called Pope, depriving Innocent X of his title. And it so happens that Etienne Delacluse wrote a historic novel about Olympia in 1843, with another edition in 1862, only a year before Manet's artwork was painted. This Olympia, therefore, this great courtesan, was the archetype of powerful women, of female popes. With this in mind, it becomes clear that the traditional subject-object polarity was subverted along with the traditional female submission to masculine desire. Therefore, the female power of castration arises.
Culbuté, entre autres termes. Il est question ici de la castration du pouvoir féminin et de la puissance du féminin. Alors,
now to draw some conclusions about this painting. First, I spoke of a philosophical divide, that is to say, a lie, which was about making naughty nudes pass for academic works that were mere mathematical abstractions. Second, I showed you that through this divide, another was exposed between the bourgeois and their sexuality. Last, I showed you that, worse still, Olympia inverted the traditional male-female polarity and the relationship that underlies it, of women's submission to men. Now we understand why I initially said that critics were dumbfounded, made impotent by this phallic and castrating woman.
On aura terminé sur Olympia, qui était donc.
But now that we've finished with Olympia, a major work from Manet's early career, we can look at a bar at the Folies Bergère,
qui est le bar aux Folies Bergère. Je vous rappelle qu'il est handicapé lorsqu'il peint.
One last point, I forgot a small detail, a caricature, the birth of the small cabinet maker. She is conveyed in a very masculine way here, accompanied by a cat with a raised tail, apparently a very phallic symbol. Of course you can rely on the caricaturists, as per usual, to note all of the details.